introduction. This class will be the third class of render and focal point. Thank you, Sasha, for sharing the valuable knowledge with us in the past 3 classes. And the next one will be a perspective. We will talk about perspective, and Sasha will point out common mistakes that people makes in production. And thank you very much. Sasha, let's just, you can speak, I can hear you.
All right, all right, thank you. Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Like Ada said, it would be the last of those introductory classes where we simply outline the subjects of interest to us as professional artists. And from then on, we will try to switch to a more profession-oriented type of class where we will be talking about hands-on technical things. But I also want to make a suggestion that not to make the process too boring or too hard for everybody. We will probably do like 2 technical classes, and then we will interchange them with sessions where we would take our good artists' work and basically take 2 or 3 examples and pull them apart, trying to figure out how it was constructed, why it works, and what useful things we can use. So anyway, let me share screen now, and we will start our session here. So we'll start with a little overview, the history, because what we use in our painting, it didn't come by itself. It's not like, you know, you put a still life or you look out the window, take a brush, digital or traditional, and just start laying colors. It doesn't work that way, because the real world deals with absolute color and tonal values. We have a limited range. We need to have certain methods to translate this richness of the outside world on our canvas. There is also such thing as artistic interpretation, where we need to decide which elements we take and how we modify them so they're relevant to the visual stories we're trying to tell. Okay, so we'll start from the very beginning. So when people start dabbling in depictive arts in caves, and later on we arrived in ancient Egypt, and for incredibly long period of 5,000 years or even more, the world for painters was flat. They worked in the flat colors, concentrating on the graphic aspect, until something happened, and the Greek culture that later evolved into what they call Hellenistic culture, where Greek and Roman art and other influences were mixed together, came around, and it kind of seems to come out of nowhere. But there are some interesting stories, for example, about 2 Greek artists who were doing traditional Egyptian style sculpture, and then they went to an Egyptian temple in the desert, where they served as apprentices for 10 years. And after 10 years, the priests gave them a scroll that had a magic line that was called the Line of Beauty. And once they learned how to use it, they went back to Greece and they started producing what we know as a Greek classical art. There are no surviving examples of Greek painting because everything was destroyed. We only have written testimony, but there are some things that can give us a glimpse. So here we come. This is a fresco from a Pompeian house. And this is not a high-end portrait painter doing it. This is more of an equivalent of our regular dude, the craftsman, who does the house decoration. But you can see how beautifully is modeled the female figure here. The proportions are correct. The composition is very nice with all the flow. And although it's fresco and uses a very restricted palette, it's graphically, it's a very pleasant image. And there is another source. Um, at the end of Hellenistic era in Egypt, people were adorning the coffins of their dead with their portraits, just like people do these days, the photographs in the cemetery. So those were, again, just regular mid-level craftsmen doing this. But if you look at these portraits, you know, you would have to scroll for considerable time on ArtStation to find a work that has such poetry and expressiveness, even though it's done with such simple and economical means. So that was a beautiful world full of incredible, breathtaking things, and then it collapsed. Dark Ages came, and the world became flat again. Because the world was considered a place of sin and violence and evil, the artists stayed in the monasteries. They wouldn't look at the outside world, which is the only source for our work. Instead, they had little private notebooks where they copied all graphic elements that were copied from another artist and copied again and copied again. And this is how they created those images. It's a copy of a copy that has nothing to do with real world. And so it continued for almost 200 years until something happened. A churchman was passing a field with a herd of sheep, and he saw a little boy drawing the sheep on a piece of smooth stone with charcoal. They looked so lifelike that he went to his parents, and he asked them to give him an apprenticeship with one of the painters in a convent. This little boy was Giotto, who revolutionized the art once and for all. He was the first to observe the real world, and he noticed that in the ambient lighting, and for hundreds of years, artists were working with ambient lighting or diffuse lighting from a skylight because they work in the studios. You notice that if an object is lit by that type of lighting, one part is brighter, one is less, and the other one is dark. He was the guy, imagine, one person in the entire world who came up with the idea of a tritone shading that we use every day, where we have the mid-tone that has the proper color swatch of the object. We have a bright desaturated highlight, and we have desaturated dark shadow. So this method became instantly so popular, propagated everywhere. And it was going like this for a while until another breakthrough happened in the land of Flanders, which is modern Belgium. So these artists, they worked in fresco with mineral pigments and in tempera. And the colors are pretty muted. It's difficult to create a highly saturated or contrasted beautiful image until in Belgium, two brothers, Jan and Hubert van Eyck, invented oil paints. Suddenly, our artists had an instrument with which they could paint anything, like literally anything. And what you see here is the first work that they produced using the new media. Now, let me tell you, if you ever have in life a chance to travel to Europe, you got to go to the city of Ghent and see this painting because it's still unsurpassed. It was produced 500 years ago. It still looks fantastic. No photograph is even close to what it is in reality. Why? They developed first a method how to deal with tone and color. they said, okay, let's separate the two because it's impossible to solve this problem simultaneously. So they would take a white background, they trace the drawing, then they would paint the shading in a brown paint with many layered washes. And then on top, they would go with color glazing, 5, 10, 15 layers. So in the end, when it's dry, the light comes through the layers as if it were a gemstone, a jewelry, and gets reflected. So you get the color effect that impossible to achieve even with modern paint. Unfortunately, because they had to wait till it gets dry, producing something like that would take 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So nobody could really have access to this art, and art was kind of going in circles until the merchant revolution came. People, the middle class, had money. They started building big houses. They wanted their big paintings to decorate them. And the next breakthrough come in Italy. These are some details you can see that 500 years ago, people were capable of doing that. And to do that, they also developed certain rendering conventions to understand how the metal reflection works, how to paint gemstones, how to paint certain types of clothes, and we will talk briefly about it. So, first of all, Gian Battista Alberti consolidated everything people knew about the space that they tried to draw intuitively and developed a scientific theory of perspective. Suddenly, artists could depict a realistic depth in their paintings. And with that, also came understanding that if we can construct the space and we understand how light behaves there, we can also construct the shading, and then we can modify it to fit the artistic idea of the visual story we want to tell. So all of a sudden, it became possible to create a compelling dramatic composition using the light as a key feature and in the image, where you could create those magnificent sculpted accents that would leave your eye for the painting, making a static image come to life, or making it literally dynamic. And not only that, the rendering was developed to such point that artists could depict anything to almost, more than a photographic level. They wouldn't do photography because photography is just a single exposure. What they try to create is our impression when we see the real world and do it in a poetic way. And among those artists, there was a particular one, Vermeer, who is unsurpassed master of value. Now, if you look at the image, you can see how economic he is with his paints. There's not much of detail. Detail is used only in the focal point here, but his values are so right that he doesn't even need to paint detail. Look at the face. There is nothing there. It's just a hint of an earring, some highlights on his hair, the highlight on his forehead. But as we zoom out, if we squint our eyes, you could say it's like cinematographic quality image here. So I strongly encourage you to look at the work of this artist because he's one of the greatest examples. So now let's move to a more practical side here. Let's go back to technical side of it. When we work on complex subjects, we of course trying to approximate it to something simple and building the complexity years. So let's say we go back to Giotto. right? What was important about his discovery of a tritone rendering are, first of all, it allowed us, it allowed us to depict an illusionary volume, right, by simply creating a gradient. But you probably noticed that in your work, you're required to render different type of environments. One of them from, I don't know, temple in a cave. And it would be difficult to find a real photograph, especially if you're doing concept work. There are no photography for it. If you know how the shading works, then you would just, hey, if I'm showing the object in a space where there is no key light, and I just follow that logic, right? Behind this object would be a dark background. Okay, it works for this particular cylinder, but if I am to show the space, I need probably to reverse the scheme and imagine that in this space, there's some kind of a light source that create a diffuse ambient lighting, right? So this gives us an instant solution. We could look at the object and say, all right, there is some kind of light coming from behind. There's a roof over this object. So this part would be in a cast shadow, right? And one of the conventions developed in the tritone rendering was that we have a shade, and then we have the cast shadow that is darker. The reason for most of these cases, the shading gets the bounce from the ground, and it gets the light from the sky dome, whereas the cast shadow gets light only from the sky dome. Of course, it's not as primitive as that, but as a general schematic, it works most of the time. So I would say, all right, this part in the cast shadows would be the darkest. And then here comes the shade. And this light that comes from behind and kind of washes around the object, right? Creating this light gradient. And since we're reversing the scheme, then the darkest part of the shade would be the one closest to us, right? So we have this. And then we can say, maybe there is a little of a bounce coming from the plane it stands on. So we would just create a gradient, enhancing the contrast towards the top, right? Or to make it look a little bit more sophisticated, we could play the reverse game and say, no, actually, for our painting, this area is more interesting because there will be more detail, and then we will create ambient occlusion, okay, around this image, and we could darken it to the bottom. So you have to understand this is absolutely artificial, right? Because it's a real world adapted to 0 to 255 range, but it works. Now, one thing of this method when people worked from white background, built up the volume using washes, was it took a very long time and it required a lot of precision. So there had to be a technical answer to that. And of course, it came to us from Italy. The Italians had two reasons for it. The paint costs money, and especially during these eras, the pigments were rather rare, like blues or greens. The other thing is, if we look at the image, we will analyze that in most cases, the majority, like 50% of the image, is in the range of the mid-tone, okay? And if we take this method where we first try to solve the grayscale and then apply paint. The first logical step would be, all right, I have my thumbnail, okay, here of this composition. I know more or less that, okay, there will be light coming here, there will be shadow, there will be shade, and I will have some kind of a background there. So this approximately is my overall mid-tone. So what the Italians would do, they would say, all right, we would just create a background that is roughly the mid-tone of our painting. This way we don't have to paint all of it when we model the form, right? We just have to add a little bit of the shading here, right? And then we just need to add light on a brightly lit surface. And then we can go and paint in a dark cast shadow. And the deal is done. The object is here in no time at all. And I remember when I was studying it for traditional oil painting, one of the things, like the glass in the water. And you look at the paintings of our famous artists, and you think like, how did they do it? How they make the glass look transparent? But they use this very method, and it makes it very, very easy. So here's your, let's say it's a glass, right? You just look at the object and see, okay, there are dark reflection, and then there would be the main reflection from the key light, a highlight on the, there would be second reflection in the back, and that was highlight. There might be like extra reflections from other sources in the scene, and then you'll have refraction here and there. And there would be a little bit of a dimming of the liquid compared to the glass itself. So there we go. It's done. And it's not natural. We have to think about it. We have to understand where in space is the object, where is the light source, at what angle the light hits the object, like this or like that, where would be the highlight, right? So mentally, when we look at the objects, all the time we're trying to break them into simple surfaces. So for example, here's a cube, but there will be an edge, right? And let's say the light comes from the top here. So this would receive one value, right? And it gets sun and the sky. This one gets less of the sun because it's vertical. But this edge, if we look at the profile, it gets the light head on. So that would be the brightest one. So when we do this tritone rendering here, right, we could just do something like that, right? Select a swatch, say, all right, this should be something darker, okay. All right, and then the front would get light. All right, let's select the swatch for light, fill. Okay, then the top would get the higher value, okay, fill. And then the surface here would get the same amount of light as the top. So we have a very rough approximation of the object, but it doesn't look, let's start refining. Okay, this surface creates a bounce. So when that element, we would just create a little gradient. Something like this, right? And if we work in Photoshop, we could create on a different separate layer and then adjust it. And then we want to enhance the relative contrast on that edge because it's the closest to us, right? And there's a layer of air that softens everything that goes into background, right? So by that token, we could just slightly increase the contrast here. I'll do it like very roughly, right? And create a nice gradient towards here, do the same there, and we will be making our painting the brightest value approximately one tone down, because in the end, we would need to introduce the highlights, right? And we cannot use 254. They have different, so this highlight would be lower, but relatively brighter than those two. So as we can create a pretty, okay, connections, pretty realistic depiction of the object. So this is our one particular aspect of our rendering. Apart from that, there are other things that we need to know how to paint. For example, if we paint metals or reflective surfaces, we need to know like what is the difference between a metallic type of reflection that works like a mirror, or dielectrics like paint or even human skin that use Fresnel type of reflection. How reflection deems in a surface if, for example, here, this is a reflective surface. What is its strength, right? That means that as we work, we are trying to solve several problems, and they could be described as what, where, and how much. So what requires a knowledge of how the lighting work, and okay, so we need to be able to first to construct the object correctly in perspective, because it gives us the wireframe to work with. And then based on this wireframe, the lighting. And this is how we do it, right? We have the projection of the sun ray, for example, on the ground, and that gives us a point where the shading begins, right? Where it touches the object. And to construct the shadow correctly, we need to see the invisible edge of it, right? So we could do the same step here, and that would give us, if we extend the surface, that would give us the correct shape. We need to know the length of it, right? So we need to see like what critical points that define the geometry. For example, in the cube, those, right? Like what edge casts what shadow. So, and we need to be able to mentally clean in our head with all the objects, especially when we do concept sketches. So we could select a lighting direction that will showcase our way. This doesn't work compositionally before objects. We could try and change lighting and say, all right, light should come from this direction because we want the ratio between shade and light, something like 25 to 75, because that would work best for the image. Or we want to use our shadows as a compositional element. So we'll take lighting parallel to our scene, because that would produce this, and suddenly it becomes a strong and interesting graphic element here. So this is where. And now the last, and equally important, is how much. Now, let me share with you that for many years and even now, there are moments where, you have that angry tears of helplessness because it's not working. I don't know why it's not working. The thing is, it's not impossible to figure how much. The only source for us is the outside world. So whenever we say that we work from imagination, in reality, we work from this multitude of pre-memorized images that we have on our hand. When you see comic artists drawing a seemingly dynamic action figure, okay, and you think like, what a miracle. It's a pre-memorized image, okay? Because if you ask somebody very simple thing, I am with discussions, I stopped doing that, with people who tell me, I bought 10 conceptart.org about how to draw humans, and I watched all of them, and that makes me an artist. I can draw any human from imagination. And now I disregard it. But at some points, it made me really upset. And I told the person, you know what? Let's put the statement to the test. I want you to do something very, very simple. I really want to make it easy for you. I will give you a subject that you're intimately familiar with. And I don't want color, okay? I'm happy with grayscale. So what I want from you is that you draw me a self-portrait, and I want the camera looking from here, and I want directional light coming from there with cast shadows. Go for it, Tiger, okay? The bet is 10,000 US dollars. When you finish, take your time. We'll take a photograph of you and compare. Well, he never talked, but I think he got the point. Right? So we need to look at that side work. Now, let's go back to rendering. There was another very important aspect of the Italian technique. So if we start with white canvas, and let's say I have a yellow cube. All right, easy peasy. I go to my color swatch. I select a color that I think looks good, right? So if I have a white canvas, take my artistic brush. There it is. And I put it here. Shit, I have no idea whether it's a good saturation or not, or whether it's a good brightness or not, because there is no reference. But if I cared to approximately model the shading in my image, this is not a problem anymore, because that's what I do. And it works the same way it works for the oil painting, Photoshop. So let's say I want this surface to have that yellow, right? So I put it here, and what I have to do is I need to squint my eyes to the point I almost don't see color. So when I do it, I can see that the image is just the brush stroke. It's just than this gray. Okay, so I fix it. Then I need a swatch for the shaded part. Okay, I go and say like, all right, it would be maybe redder. So here it's off, right? So again, I squint my eyes and go into my pop-up for saturation, and first I adjust it almost like, you know, like a gamma on a monitor until the grayscale matches. Now, if you desaturate it 100%, it wouldn't have a saturation plays role, right? So if I think the saturation is too much, I will just lower it. So now I can color pick and start painting, and within each swatch, I will try two, like one that would be pushed a little bit color towards colder part of the gamut, right? And then I'll have another one that I will push towards warmer part, always trying to preserve the same grayscale balance, right? So what does it do? The difference is almost imperceptible. But if I colorize this base, those two swatches, okay, the color receives depth because these different hues mix in our eye, and we see that there is a richness to this surface. Especially when we work from photographic reference. Like what people do, they color pick. Okay, color pick all you want if it gives you the basic color swatch. But you have to understand that it will sample only 1 pixels or 3 pixels or 9 pixels. And it wouldn't be necessarily the color you want to use. But if you have the grayscale model here, you're safe. And now we are almost at the end. There is another important discovery that Italians made. Now we know that we have two powerful contrasts. We have our color contrast, where we can enhance the grayscale contrast by using, for example, you know, we want to separate this more from the background, right? We don't need to take blue as a complementary. We could just take, you know, the same yellow and desaturate it to the depth. And that yellow here would look cold. If we desaturate it even more, okay, and we crank saturation here, would look slightly bluish. It works better in traditional media, but it's still valid for the Photoshop. So why is it useful? It's because if we push this one here, in an extra color, right? We need to be very careful. When they teach traditional painting, they tell you almost from the day one, it's easy to harmonize 2 colors. 3 is good. 4 is for masters. 5 is impossible, all right? So don't go there. You need to create an impression of 5 different colors. You stick to 4 and use this simultaneous contrast using desaturated values to create an illusion. Now, I'm not that smart with this by myself, right? But I read things about history of art, and this is why I know it. It happens in the 17th century when rich tourists were coming to Venice, and they wanted like full-size postcards, huge, of the city. And there is one painter, Canaletto, which is also on the list I gave you, that shop with 15 assistants, and they were producing, you know, like hot cake, beautiful vistas of Venice. Now, there's one problem. They worked at fixed rate, and our English lords wanted blue skies. But the blue pigment at the time, there were no synthetic paints. So the blue pigment was made out of the mineral called lapis lazuli, and its cost was the weight in gold. So if you painted it like a really blue sky, half of your picture budget would go into the background. Now, Canaletto noticed that if he underpaints it in red and then goes with gray on top, it looks a little bit bluish. It doesn't work 100% in Photoshop, but if we go with this, is like desaturated, absolutely desaturated yellow, right? Pitched against warm element, like that. Then we can buy our expensive paint, and that's what he did. And in the corner of the painting, he would put a tiny little area of blue. But because of this effect, your eye would assume, yeah, the sky is kind of bluish. So it worked like the charm. The other important thing that they discovered and turned into rendering convention was that not only grayscale modeling and simultaneous color contrast, there's a third thing that we can use to further enhance the volume and visual impact. It's the texture and the brush strokes. And by texture, I don't mean, you know, Googling up some low-end photography and slapping it on top and multiply or add mode. No, I am referring to something different. You probably noticed when you go outside and it's an evening, dusk, right? If you look at things and try not to focus, you know, trees, leaves, you see that the image is slightly grainy, right? It's kind of shimmers because there is not a lot of light to get the resolution. So what Italians did, said, okay, we'll work in the canvas, and it doesn't need to be brown. It could be gray, right, with the same texture. But when you paint an object, let's say the same cylinder, so if you underpaint the shadow with a transparent wash, where you can see the grain of the canvas or the grain of the paint, and pitch it against your proper color of the object, which is slightly more opaque, with very, very solid lights. So the contrast here, and we need to make the cast shadow darker than the shading, right? So we'll put it in multiply for speed's sake. And we can multiply it again. So if this has that grainy structure here. First of all, it's the flat, dark shadow depth. Your eye assumes there is something there. And that grainy texture, in contrast to flat midtone and very, very strong opaque white, visually is more powerful than if we rendered everything with the same level of smoothness. Okay, so this and the brush strokes, because the brush strokes, when we paint, it's not just that we feel something with color. Ideally, each brush stroke, when we paint figurative image, they represent some part of that object with its surface detail. So we need to use brush strokes both to create an illusion of surface detail, because there's no point in copying every little chink or imperfection on the surface, right? And it also helps us to indicate the flow of the surface, right? It also helps us to create a certain visual. So by varying our strokes, like from smooth and big for the background and very confident and precise for the lit parts, we also create a visual rhythm that gives richness and makes our image much more powerful than if it were rendered with an airbrush, okay, or in a paint over of a computer. So I guess that's probably it. We're a little bit over 45 minutes. So I'll stop sharing screen.
Yeah. So, is there any questions? If you have questions, you can type in, and I just left an artist list that gathered by Sasha, so you can copy and save it and check it out. Most of them are traditional artists, several of them are contemporary artists, so you can check it out and learn from the master. And this is the last class for rendering and focal point. And next one, we will talk about perspective. This is another big topic that influenced the quality of the image a lot. And Sasha noticed that a lot of artists actually making a lot of mistakes on perspective. So next section is very important. And thank you, Sasha, for the valuable class. And it solved the issue, things like, oh, why the sky is not blue enough, or why the fire is not looks warm enough, is because of the color combination is wrong. So we saw that very often. Seems simple, but when we are handling a complex image,
it's not simple. It's not
okay.
simple.
Yeah, it's pretty complex issue, so we need to put into practice. Right.
Yeah, we've just managed to squeeze in 500 years of art in 45 minutes, which was a lot. But let me just say, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I really encourage you to look at traditional artists, and you can look them up. You know, this list are here. It's very limited. I picked it on the basis of the kind of illustration we do daily, but look them by keywords, I don't know, like adventure or historical painting, you know, ancient world. You will be surprised
Yeah.
how much you can find.
Yeah. Cool. This list takes a long time to gather. So if you need it and you didn't have time to copy it, ask me in privately in Skype chat. I can send over to you the file. And thank you, Sasha, for the class. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Bye,
Thank you so
guys.
much. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.